Hello and welcome to the Stonebridge Press podcast. I'm your host, Peter Goodman. I'm in Berkeley, California, and with me in Brooklyn, New York is Michael Palmer. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Peter.
Now, for more about Stonebridge and our books on Japan and Asia, visit www.stonebridge.com. Today's guest is Mark Gibeau. Mark is a senior lecturer in the School of Culture, History and Language at Australian National University in Canberra, where I guess it's kind of warm and sunny and hot right about now in summer. Hi, Mark.
Hello. And yeah, it's beautiful out today.
So Mark is the translator of A Shameful Life by Osamu Dazai, which was published in 2018 by Stonebridge Press. And it is continuing to receive attention, not only because Dazai has been embraced in recent years by a lot of younger readers, but also because there are a number of other literary properties getting attention in different formats that are based on his works. And more to the point, Japanese novel Ningen Shikkaku, into which A Shameful Life has been translated, is being released in a few months by Tuttle in yet another new translation as No Longer Human, which actually is the same title that the work was first released as in English back in 1958. Earlier translation was by Donald Keene. The new one from Tuttle is by Juliet Winters Carpenter, and those are both two very highly esteemed translators by readers and actually by their fellow translators. And I've discovered, of course, that there's also a musical theater production and a manga based on Ningen Shikkaku. I found about the musical theater production was supposed to happen in Shanghai. I don't know if it ever happened.
Let's pretend it did, though. It's nice to think that there was.
Yes. Well, maybe we'll get some additional royalties, when they set your words to tune. So anyway, like everyone these days is kind of feasting on Dazai and his somewhat morbid celebration of existential despair. And I wonder why that might be, like a sign of our pessimistic times. Or one thing that occurs to me is Ningen Shikkaku is that the copyright ran out.
Sure.
So the property is available. And so presumably there may be many other Japanese classics from the pre-war, just post-war period that are going to be making new appearances and new translations. So I want to talk a little bit about Shameful Life. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things, of course, that strikes people about this is that the title is different from the English title by which the work was known and introduced into the West and sort of has stuck with it. And I remember when you first submitted it, I think it was The Clown or...
Yeah, I went through a number of much less successful titles than what I ended up with. I think A Shameful Life was your suggestion, wasn't it?
Oh, it was? Oh, okay. Well, I never remember these things. To me, it's all collaborative. I don't remember. Maybe you can refresh me. Did we discuss whether we should say, hey, why not just call it No Longer Human?
I don't know how much we got into it. I think the clear impression I got was that you would prefer that it have absolutely no overlap with Keene. And I was quite anxious for that as well, because the last thing I wanted was people thinking that I was trying to ride on Keene's coattails and, trick the reader into buying my translation instead. So I think we're both on the same page.
Think about it now. I don't think it was the wrong decision, but as I confront Tuttle coming up with their, I don't know if they had any reservations about it, but if they did, they put them aside. They've gone ahead and titled their book No Longer Human. And if you go and you look at the earlier edition of No Longer Human on Amazon, at the very top of the page, it says there's a newer edition available, and it takes you to the Tuttle edition.
I mean, it is a brilliant title, right? It's hard to talk No Longer Human, even though...
Yeah, I agree. Would you explain to people who don't know what the Ningen Shikkaku actually means in the original Japanese?
Well, the reason it's not translated more literally is because it really doesn't work if you try to translate it literally. So Shikkaku means to fail or to be disqualified. And Ningen means human. So it's kind of like a disqualified human or a failed human or somebody who was just never really managed to become human. So it's a great impactful title that does carry a lot of the nuances of the original title. But I do think it's important to distinguish translations. I'm reading some reviews and people complaining that, they bought A Shameful Life thinking that it was a new novel by Dazai. It's just No Longer Human.
Right.
Sorry, I don't know what else I can do on it. It does say Ningen Shikkaku on the cover, so...
Yeah, there may not be a really good solution to it. I mean, my feeling was you were coming at it as a translator and following in the footsteps of Donald Keene, but I was thinking of it just in terms of confusion in the marketplace. In terms of copyright, my understanding of the law is that you can't copyright a title per se, but if you're using it as a way of hoodwinking possible consumers into thinking your product is somebody else's, then you can run into accusations of consumer fraud. I wasn't thinking that anyone was going to think it was fraud, but I guess I just sort of felt that out of respect, for my fellow publisher, I didn't want to step on their toes or anything, and I'm a little sad to see that not everyone shares my sense of collegial respect.
If Keene's translation of the title had been a bit more literal, then the argument for retaining it would be a lot stronger. Because you're just translating. But it's quite a unique move on his part to decide to translate it in that way.
That's a good point. It's sort of like Genji Monogatari, right? Which Tale of Genji. Well, what else you got to call it? Story of Genji.
Genji time.
Right. More to the point, though, is that you have now 3 translations of the same book coming out, and I'll talk to you because you're here and why did you feel like a new translation was necessary?
I mean, I hadn't read Keene's translation for ages. To be honest, when I first read it, I didn't like it, and it wasn't because of Keene's translation. I didn't get Dazai at that stage, and I didn't understand the genre of writing that Dazai was working in. I was more used to 19th century European literature, that sort of thing, with a clearly defined plot and story arcs and so on. So I really didn't get the whole novel thing. So I came back to him much later, but this time in the Japanese, and I thought he was amazing. I just loved his sentences. I loved the style of writing. I love the way that he could create this voice. And even though the work was, 70 years old, it felt very immediate. And so I thought it would be interesting just as a translation exercise to see how I could go about translating it. And then I just didn't stop. I think I went through 11 or 12 drafts of it. I mean, I really got out of control. But the whole time, I mean, as it started to evolve into a real project, there was certainly a sense of terror. It's like, I'm going to put this out against Keene, and people are going to throw stones at me and be really mean.
Do you feel that there's any succinct way of explaining how your translation might differ from Keene's, the content, presumably? And
I think it's primarily the idiom. So Keene's writing about 60 years prior to my translation, and the kind of English that Keene writes in and the kind of English that his readership would be expecting has changed a lot over 60 years. After I had finished my translation, I didn't refer to Keene while I was translating at all. But after I was finished, I reread Keene's, and I did feel a little bit vindicated. I mean, so for example, the other day, I just reread The Setting Sun, which came out a year before Ningen Shikkaku. And Keene's translation, I thought, was just outstanding. And I think one of the reasons that worked really well is that in the story, the characters are this kind of declining aristocratic family. And so his style of English continues to resonate. It still feels a little old, but it should feel a little old. And it feels a little ornate because it ought to, because that's the language that they're speaking in.
So if I understand what you're saying, in Shameful Life, the story itself it's so internal, it's raw, and it maybe needs to be expressed in a way that's a lot more personal and revealing, which...
For me, yeah, I thought, and I'm sure that people who prefer Keene's translation will disagree, and that's perfectly fine. But I did think that more immediacy, because that immediacy is so central to everything that the novel's trying to do, was needed. And for that, kind of English that people would feel more familiar with.
Is that generally a part of your own written style, or did you have to work to develop the voice of the narrator?
No. It was a lot of, so one of the things I like about translating is you get to experiment with all of these different voices. So I'm just finishing up a project that's a pseudo-historical novel. And you have people speaking all these different idioms. So you have people in that novel, you have people writing in classical Chinese and classical Japanese and old-fashioned Japanese and then modern Japanese, and trying to manipulate all of that in English to at least give the reader a taste of what's happening in the original is quite fun, really. I'm a fan of historical fiction in English as well, so it gives me a chance to bring in a lot of different things. For Dazai, I did 11 drafts, so that tells you something about how I struggled with the voice, because most of that is trying to get that sense of immediacy. So Dazai is a very sophisticated writer, and his sentences, he'll have sentences in the Japanese that go on for a page and a half, and they just flow. I mean, Japanese is built that way, but also the way that Dazai writes it makes it work. And for me, a lot of it was trying to balance, this immediacy, which again, I thought was really central to the novel as a whole, but also without sort of dumbing down his style, if I can put it that way.
Do you feel that these are basically can be read together? Yours and Keen's can be read kind of as a pair, as opposed to trying to figure out which one is the truer to the original, if that's even the point of translation?
On the one hand, so for example, Juliet Winters Carpenter, she's an absolutely amazing translator. I think any translation we get from her is a gift. So I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I'm really keen to see what she did, but on the other hand, I'm also, my insecurities. Will they survive it? I don't know. It's just a different take. I don't think there is such a thing as a truer translation. I will say that Keen did make one mistake that I was able to find in his translation, which I think I fixed. Which is not to say I haven't made mistakes that he didn't make. And he also edited out some parts. So in that respect, I feel confident saying that mine is a complete translation, at least in terms of the content, and doesn't make one mistake that Keen makes.
Well, maybe Julie Winters Carpenter will be able to say, well, I found one thing that Mark did, and
I'm sure she'll be able to find more than one.
I'm curious what your take is on why Dazai specifically in Ningen Shikkaku seems to resonate with each generation. It was my introduction to Japanese literature. I'm a millennial. I'm in my 30s. And now Dazai is a character in a very popular anime, a current anime. And there are all these 14, 15-year-old kids that are getting really into it now. And obviously, it was big when it came out, and, you latched onto it. And I wonder, what, from your perspective, having translated it, what is underneath that seems to really grab everybody, no matter, their background?
It's funny you mentioned that, especially you mentioned 14, 15-year-olds. So in Japanese, there's this phrase called chunibyo, which is, there's this illness or malaise that all second-year middle school students or junior high school students undergo. And that's when they tend to gravitate to Dazai. So these kinds of existential issues, who am I? Nobody understands me. The world is full of frauds and so on. These are, of course, all central themes in Dazai's story. So he's quite famous for being popular amongst the chunibyo crowd. I think there's a few reasons for it. First of all, the writing itself. And again, this is one of the reasons I thought it deserved retranslation. But despite having been written so long ago, the writing really hasn't aged. It's still very accessible to a modern contemporary Japanese reader. And that's one of the things I wanted to bring across in my translation. The other reason, I think, is that a lot of the writers of that time, writing in this vein, where they sort of expose all their deep, dark secrets, they really come off as very unlikable people. They abuse their position of authority. They behave poorly towards other people and exploit them and so on.
I hate to put you on the spot, but can you give an example?
Well, it's a bit older, but Shimazaki Toson, for example, who I'm just about to cover in my class next week, but he wrote this story where, so first of all, he slept with his niece, which is never a good idea. And then after sleeping with his niece, he writes a novel about sleeping with his niece and publishes it. And so now his niece's life is ruined. And then he runs off to France to escape. Because he has the ability to do so, all in the name of art, of course. Now, Dazai is hardly a moral paragon, but he, at least in his literature, he portrays himself not as the one doing the pursuing, but the one who is pursued. And even when he's behaving badly, he portrays himself doing it out of weakness, and he's suffering for it. and he's suffering at least as much as the other people, if not more, at least from his perspective. Not to excuse in any way what Tsushima Shuji actually did in his life and the way that he treated his family, but it's a more, I'd say, non-threatening protagonist that maybe makes it easier for a broader and more contemporary audience to relate to than somebody like Shimazaki Toso, who's a very authoritative, dominant figure behaving badly. I think it creates a very different impression on the reader. And of course, the themes, I was speaking with a colleague from a university I used to work at in Japan about this, and she was saying, I don't get why he keeps saying nobody can possibly understand me when everybody feels exactly the same way as he does. And that's part of it as well, this universal feeling of being misunderstood.
Well, let's just talk about kind of translation in general. When you approach a translation, do you kind of knock the whole thing off, just kind of staring, looking at the Japanese and typing on your keyboard until you get to the end and then go back and start fixing it? Or are you more kind of one chapter, one paragraph at a time? How do you actually go about doing that magic?
Yeah, I kind of liken it to, I don't know anything about sort of visual arts, but I kind of liken it to sculpting. So if you're making a sculpture, then you get the rough outline first, and then you go back again and again and again, you refine it. And that's kind of the technique I use. So my first draft is usually very rough. I just need to get words on a page. And then once I have something that I'm reasonably confident is mostly correct, at least in terms of, the linguistic aspect of things, then I tend to, this is not a very efficient process, I know, but what I do is I tend to, I'll do one draft referring to the original line by line, and then I'll go back and I'll do another draft without referring to the original at all, just trying to make the English work. And then I'll go back again and I'll read through again the line by line comparison and sort of bring it back closer to the original. And then I'll go and do it again in English and try to polish it, and sort of going back and forth that way.
It's telling that you say that you do a line by line translation the first draft, then the second draft you don't look at the original. You're really more concerned with the English, which I guess suggests to me the focus of the translation is as much on the target audience, the fact they have to read it in English, as it is on the accuracy of getting the sensibility of the author.
Yeah, I also teach a Japanese to English literary translation class here, and I find that the aspect that students struggle with most is not the Japanese, it's the English. J. Rubin refers to his translation as writing, and I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Obviously you need to understand the Japanese, but, Dazai is an amazing writer, and to try to produce something in English that at least passes on a significant proportion of that requires a lot of work on the English side of things.
I don't know how much you read around, but are there translations out there that you feel are marvelous, wonderful translations, but deviate quite a bit from what you know the original Japanese to be? You don't have to answer that question.
Yeah, I'm not going to shame any translators. It's so easy to criticize a translation, and I've been subject to it as well. But because you're making so many hundreds of decisions, and all you've got to do is find one that removed from context seems absurd, and then just trash the translation on that basis. So, in terms of a really free translator, this is not a criticism. J. Rubin's kind of a hero of mine when it comes to translators. But when I first started literary translation, or started thinking about doing it as a form of practice, what I would do is I would look at a passage of a Murakami novel, I would translate it a paragraph or two, I would compare it to J. Rubin's translation, then I would sit down and cry for a little while, and then I'd go and I'd try to highlight what I saw as, because it really exposed the flaws in my writing and showed me a different way of translating. So he has no qualms about moving things around. He doesn't deviate in important ways, but in unimportant ways, he will just do whatever he feels is right in order to convey the key elements of the text. So when I'm teaching my translation class, I try to get my students to think consciously about, okay, so what is this paragraph trying to do? What kind of, mood or atmosphere or emotion or content is it trying to convey? And then what's the best way to replicate that in English without necessarily focusing too much on the grammatical structure and the language itself.
And the languages are so very, very different.
Yes.
It's like, what does it mean to translate Japanese into English? What exactly are you aiming at? It's not just the content, but you were saying it's the mood, the sensibility, the atmosphere, the way that those things are communicated in Japanese are, of course, totally different from the way that they're communicated in English. There can't be a one-to-one correspondence, but to the extent that there is a close correspondence, do you think that is necessarily more successful?
I mean, for me, when I'm translating, I think what I'm trying to do is to recreate my experience of reading the text in Japanese in English. So there's definitely going to be a lot of subjectivity involved and subjective interpretation. So I'm trying not to consciously insert myself. But on the other hand, I mean, I'm not so naive as to think I can completely isolate myself from the text and just, a text only exists through its interaction with the reader. Otherwise, it's just lines on a piece of paper.
Yeah, I mean, you're suggesting that a translator needs to be a sensitive reader, first off.
Well, there's a lot implied in Japanese, right? So just as a general linguistic experience, there's a lot of context. It's a high context language. Things aren't really spelled out, so you have to kind of pick things up that way. So grammatically, there's that aspect of it too. In terms of A Shameful Life, for example, this may not be the best example, but there's the passage where he sort of hints at being sexually abused as a child. In Japanese, it's pretty subtle. He just calls it, these terrible things that people did to me. But from the larger context, it's pretty clear what that means. So when I was translating it, trying to balance those two things. So he's not coming straight out and saying, these people molested me, but he sort of is. Whereas if you're not reading carefully, then, it could just be interpreted as, oh, they were mean to me, they bullied me, or something like that.
Well, that's certainly something that would have been handled very differently in the 1950s as opposed to the 2010s, right?
Yeah, I don't remember how Keane treated that. I would assume that he picked up on it as well because it's just so brilliant. But how he would have expressed it, I don't know. I haven't looked at his translation in ages.
Would you say that a translator improves over time because their understanding of, say, Japanese improves, and they're something that really does, you can feel your skills improving the way a musician might?
Yeah, I think, Meredith McKinney, right?
Yes.
She's also based quite close to me, and she comes to campus quite often. But she talks about translation as a craft. So she sees herself as a craftsperson rather than artist. And I don't know, I'd say she's probably an artist too, but translation as a craft, though, I think that's a pretty good assessment. And the more you do it, as long as you're working at it, the better you're going to get. And part of it is because the more you translate, the more sensitive a reader you become. So the way that I look at literature now, when I'm reading something, I'm always thinking, in the back of my head, okay, how would I translate this? And it makes you more attentive to things maybe that you wouldn't otherwise. This project that I'm just wrapping up now, it's funny because I covered this novel in my PhD dissertation years and years ago, and I thought, well, it's a challenging novel, but it's not that bad. And then I sat down to translate it, and it really was that bad. It really was. So I had no idea what I was getting myself into.
The translator's toolbox has improved a lot in the last 20 years, say, I'm sure from when you were starting out. And now everyone's talking about AI. And where do you come down on AI? And
so I'll use dictionaries first, and then if I'm still not clear on something, then I tend to use lingui.com, which is kind of a bilingual corpus. And what it does is it'll give you phrases in their context, because that's usually the bit that I'm missing. So the dictionary will give you a meaning, but what does it mean here? Is where I struggle. So I'm leery of using AI. I don't want it to bias the way that I look at things, because it's, for me anyway, when I'm really struggling, it's when I've got, there's an expression on the tip of my tongue, or a word on the tip of my tongue. I'm just trying to get it out there. And so if I get blasted with a bunch of examples, then it may be lost forever. Anyway, that's how I think about it.
Do you hear people in your profession worried that somehow their their job is going to be supplanted by these machines and bots.
Well, I think if you're a technical translator, you ought to be very, very worried.
Right.
Yeah. I think the real fear, is that companies won't understand the difference between having a human translator, somebody who's a specialist in literary translation, and a machine translation. Yeah, there's a word for this, but I don't know if I should use it in the podcast.
Go ahead.
The enshittification of translation.
Perfect word.
I think is a concern. So, because if you can just pop a text into ChatGPT or something and get a translation out, have somebody edit the English a bit and publish it in a week and not pay anybody to do it.
And not have anyone complain about it.
Yeah, and if readers become used to that,
right,
then it just becomes normal, which is really criminal towards the author of the original and is really short-selling the reader.
On the other hand, there's only a limited number of you. I mean, certainly a very, very limited number of people who can do the job competently as you can. So there's an awful lot of wonderful books that have never been translated and probably never will be, because there's neither the money nor the personnel to do it. I mean, from a venal publisher's point of view, it's like, oh, we can get all this stuff out there, and it may not be perfect, but is it better to have something that's less than perfect out there as opposed to not having it out there at all?
That's a really good question. I think the answer would have to be it depends.
Of course.
I mean, a lot of literature, it's not about what they're saying, it's how they're saying it. It's the larger context. It's not information. So if you're just translating information, then machine translation, so long as it gets that information across correctly, that's fine. It may not be as graceful, but the reader is only focused on the information. But Dazai is not about information, for example. He's about, expressing these very delicate shades of emotion, this trauma and this kind of decline and all of these, quintessentially human things. That's why people still read him today. Can AI do that? Translation is an interpretation. So, and to interpret, you need experience, you need lived experience. And then, of course, to get back to your question, is imperfect better than nothing? Well, I mean, all translations are inherently imperfect. So that's not a disqualification. But if a translation misrepresents somebody, misrepresents their work, readers just turn away from that writer,
right,
or maybe even that country's literature, and say, oh, it's all rubbish.
It goes back to the translator, the importance of the translator being a sensitive reader. And in a way, you have to be a sensitive human being. You have to be an empath in a way to understand what it is that the original reader is about, and then process it through your own humanity, your own mentality, in order to render it in a way that connects with other people.
I guess when AI can produce literature, then it can translate literature.
Yeah, there you go.
I guess it also, I think for me, it's how do we look at art? Is art a commodity? Is it something that's simply, produced to be sold, or is it, a human endeavor? And I think, fundamentally it has to be a human endeavor for it to have any sort of value.
Well, that's the standard ideal. There may be a lot of cultural bias built into that somewhat ideal notion of what art is, depending on who you talk to, maybe what civilization you come from, what period of human history you're studying. It's something very different. After all, I mean, many of the great masterpieces of Western art were done on commission.
I still want to get paid. So I'm not denying that. AI may result in new forms of art that we simply can't imagine, or at least I can't simply imagine yet. And I guess, there's art from the perspective of the artist creating it, and then there's art as experienced by the viewer or the reader. And I suppose if the viewer or the reader is getting something meaningful from it, it doesn't really matter if it's AI or if it's human produced, or it's about the experience. And if it sort of helps them to see the world in a different way, that's great. But it would certainly, from purely selfish interest anyway, it'd be a shame to see the human element removed entirely. I think that would just be bizarre. It's difficult for me to imagine.
I'm happy that you were able to illustrate how much of translation is an artistic interpretation, because I think that is lost in marketing. And there's been a big push on, putting the names of the translators on books of translation where they weren't before. But I wonder what you think about Ningen Shikkaku being translated by a drug addict with mental illness.
It's actually it's quite a timely point, not because I'm undergoing any kind of substance abuse withdrawal issues, but what was her name? The poet Beth Gorman. She's a poet laureate, I think, under Obama or something. And anyway, her poem was being translated, and the publisher, they had hired, I can't remember what country, but there was a non-binary white translator who had been selected to translate the poem into a certain language. And they said, no, white person can't translate that. And there were a couple of instances where the ethnicity or race of the translator was seen by the publisher, not by the poet, but by the publisher as a sort of determining factor as to whether or not they would be able to faithfully convey the content of the literature. I'm very skeptical of that. I mean, on the other hand, I would not feel comfortable translating something that is so far beyond my realm of experience. But I don't think that, you necessarily have to be, I hope, a suicidal drug addict in order to translate Dazai. The Setting Sun, there's a lot of debate over whether that should be a Dazai novel or it should be seen as a co-authored novel with Ota Shizuko, who basically sent Dazai her diary. She was Dazai's lover at the time and had a daughter with him. And he used large sections of it verbatim, purely speculating, because this is his other major novel. And I reread it in preparation for this interview. And I was wondering, so if that were translated, how would that work? Would we put both of their names on the cover? And if we did that, well, she didn't die 60 years ago, so her estate should still have a claim to it. And, I started imagining all sorts of things.
Right.
So I started doing a little bit of research, and I found this article that addressed that. And in the sort of introduction to that, they mentioned, again, I think the poet's name is Beth Gorman, but I could be wrong. Now, this sort of back and forth about the translators and, who can actually speak for somebody else.
Well, so what are you working on now? You're working on the Abe Kobo book, and anything else catch your interest?
Yeah, I've started. So I've pretty much finished the Abe Kobo novel.
You have a publisher?
It's going through Columbia.
Okay.
The title hasn't been officially approved, but I think it'll probably come out as The Traitor. So it's a really fun novel. It's the only historical novel that Abe Kobo wrote. Being Abe Kobo, it's not like a proper historical novel. It's an Abe historical novel. Now I'm looking at Nagai Kafu.
Right.
As something just completely different, a different style of writing, a new writer for me to. Well, I mean, I've read Kafu before, and he's not as well represented in English as other writers of his stature, I think. So it would be good to see more of him.
All right. Well, we've been talking with Mark Gibeau, far away Australia, about recent translation of A Shameful Life, which was published by Stonebridge Press in 2018. At your favorite bookstore, whether it's in the physical world or the online world, it's available now. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Mark.
It was my pleasure.
Find out more about Stonebridge Press and our books and authors, go to www.stonebridge.com. You can find our Substack, The Stone Bridge, at stonebridgepress.substack.com, and you can visit and message us on Twitter at Stonebridge Pub or on Facebook at Stonebridge Press. To reach us by regular email, write to us at sbp@stonebridge.com.